There's a guy by the name of Josephus. Perhaps you know that name. He is the foremost prominent historian of the time of Christ, basically. If you want to read history on just what was going on right after Christ's death in Jerusalem, what happened with Rome and Israel and all of that, you want to read his work. Now, Josephus was a famous Pharisee and historian, but he wrote more than just his own time. He wrote the history of Israel. He wrote about it all. Now, when he went back to tell the beginning story, well, at least from the time of Moses, he ran into a certain problem. He was writing about the government system of Israel in ancient times and writing away in Greek. Now, Greek had 6 understandings of government, and they used certain phrases that they described the terms of what a government was. And there was no term that fit the concept of Israel. And so Josephus had to come up with his own term. And so what he did was combine 2 words in the Greek and came up with this term. The first was the word theos, which of course means God. The second word was kratia, which means to rule. So God rule, a theocracy. And this is where the term came from. A theocracy, in its general definition, is any government that is ruled by a divine entity, whether it's a imagined one or perceived or whatever. It is God, goddesses, big G, little g, whatever, but they are the president, they are the king of the country. That is the way. They are the high authority recognized by all. And then, of course, there will be appointed representatives from people, but in a theocracy, the people who do rule under the God, not instead of the God. So that is a theocracy in general. Now, the thing about a theocracy as a government, it goes way beyond government. Because if God is ruling, or big G, little g, whatever, that affects the very nature of everyday life. He dictates everything. He's all-encompassing all the way through things. And we do have, in the general sense, a number of theocracies even to this day. They were very prominent in ancient times in one form or another, but we still have them today. ISIS is a theocracy. Jonestown was a theocracy. Any country that is under the Islamic law of Sharia is a theocracy. So Iran and Saudi Arabia are theocracies. There's a whole lot that can go wrong with a theocracy. There's a whole lot. Just follow the wrong God, or follow the right God in the wrong way, and you end up in all kinds of trouble. You end up with a living hell that's in the ISIS state now, or you end up with senseless tragedy, like if you remember the Branch Davidian cult in Waco. That was in effect a little theocracy, and that's how it turned out. Or you can end up with a painful history of something like ancient Israel. So there's a lot that can go wrong in this thing called a theocracy. But we're not interested in looking at theocracies in general. This isn't a political science class. It is us worshiping the Lord and looking for truth from His Word. So we are going to narrow down and talk from this point on in biblical theocracies. We're looking only at biblical theocracies. The Old Testament, the biblical theocracy of the Old Testament started with Moses. It started then because this is when, before that time, Israel was a people. They were, in fact, an extended family, but they became an ethnic group in Egypt, and then now God is ready to turn them into their own nation. He's now taken them out to the promised land. Now they need to become more than just a people group. They need a constitution. They need a form of government and everything. And this is where we find the theocracy being born at this time. And in fact, as we look at Israel itself, Israel was a theocracy up until the time of Babylon. When Babylon took them captive, the theocracy ended. 700 years before Jesus, the theocracy ended. Why? Because they were never their own people after that. They were always under one dictating power or another after that time. So that's the period. We're looking at that Moses time up until really, say, the time of Isaiah in that golden millennium that we go. So here we are looking at this. How did it work? Why did it work? Why did it stop working? What's it got to say to you sitting out there today? Well, it could be an interesting venture in an academic sense, but does it have anything to do? I think when we end up with this, you'll find out it has everything to do with your walk, everything to do with how you relate to God. So let's start here. Let's start by looking at 5 key features. What makes a theocracy a theocracy? And then that will give us a starting point to run from there. In the birth of this theocracy, we know that God lays down the Old Testament. It starts that the 10 Commandments start in Exodus 20. So let's back up to Exodus 19, which is effectively 3 days before Exodus 20. In verse 5, it says this, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant." So this is, remember we talked about that suzerain treaty and all of this. Well, this is kind of hitting the other level. Now this place is being turned into its own nation. And I want a few words in here to burn into your mind, starting with these. "Then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people." You will be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And this is verse 6. Really let this one burn in. "And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This is an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because we know in the theocracy of ancient Israel, there were divisions of title, and there were priests who were the priests. Only they were the priests. And yet here God is saying, you will be my priests, my holy nation. So that line becomes very important as we move on. 5 key features. They're very obvious things if we step back and look at them. First thing is, to make a theocracy, you need a God. The God has to be present in some form in that people group. He has to be there in an intellectual sense, in belief. He has to be there in a situational sense, affecting lives, and maybe even there in a physical way. In a biblical theocracy, we find God there in all of these ways. There is a unity in authority. There's no question who the president is. There's no question of who the king is. He is there, and he is showing up in those ways. In a theocracy, there has to be anointed leadership. Anointed leadership. In other words, there has to be unity of direction. You have people, if they are the representatives, they're a common front, they're saying, in our communication from God, God says go this way, and everybody says, okay, let's all go this way. And we find that in the desert. The Jews didn't spread out everywhere, did they? They followed the leaders who were following the pillar of smoke and fire. In a theocracy, there has to be an alignment of values. And we see Israel had run into each problem. To be a citizen in a theocracy, you have to align with the God, whoever that God may be. If you don't believe in that God, how can you be part of that theocracy? If you don't follow the things that God has laid out, how can you be part of the theocracy? We see that even in the theocracies today. There has to be a direct relationship between the people and the God. It's not just enough for the leaders. Everybody has to have some sense that they're connected to God in this way. And then the 5th thing that becomes really important is there has to be an assignment of office. There has to be purposes where God puts people, and that he anoints them and equips them for those purposes. So there's a unity in purpose. No, everybody doesn't do the same job, but everybody does their own job for the same reason, for the good of all, for the good of the theocracy. So you have these 5 things: presence of God, anointed leadership, alignment of values, a direct relationship with that God, and then the assignment of purpose or office. Is there a true biblical theocracy in the world today? Do all the lessons of the Old Testament just remain rather irrelevant? How are they relevant? Well, let me give you a hint. Let me do this. I'm going to give you an Old Testament verse and a New Testament verse, and you look at the two of these together. And this is how we read earlier how God described the theocracy of ancient Israel that he was putting together. In Exodus 19:5-6, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now let's move ahead several millennia, and let's look at Peter describing the church, the early church. This is the way God, inspiring Peter, describes the church. 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. The only biblical theocracy that can exist in the world today is the one that the God ruler sets up, which he calls by only one name, the church. It's not given any other name. It can be no other thing, only the church. Some real, as we look at it, we keep this in mind too. The qualification is we're talking the biblical church. Because there's a lot of stuff out there that may call itself the church that has broken the covenant, that doesn't live by the God ruler's rule. They've been more like Korah and came up with their own. So when I say this, keep in mind I'm only talking the biblical church can be the biblical theocracy. The biblical church, as big as the world itself, it's global. There is parts of it everywhere. It is everywhere that it can go on. And yet it can be as tangible as a little place like this. Just a little church in a little community, but if it's following the God ruler's way, then it is citizenship is in this theocracy. Now, here's where it gets a little touchy. As that we move back out and we look at it, okay, church, nation, how does this all work? We often bemoan the idea that things like prayer has been removed from school, or the Ten Commandments get pulled out of courthouses. We can bemoan how there's a deterioration in the educational system or in the legal system or in the business world. There's a lot of stuff we don't like. There's a lot of stuff we know that, you pull God out of that and it's not going to go so well. And we're right in that. But there's a tendency, even movements, to change this by political and legal force. And to a point, yes, we should have a presence as citizens in the country. But here's the thing. You cannot turn a nation into a theocracy. You cannot make it truly, if I may say, a Christian nation. Really can't be done. How so? Well, the real reason that it was a Christian nation, as we refer to that in days past, is because first and foremost, all the people involved in this nation, this physical nation's education system, and its courts and its laws, leaders and all of this, before they were citizens in this kingdom, they were citizens in the Holy Kingdom. And so the impact, the influence just flowed from one to the other. So the whole nation, as it became less so, as there were less citizens in that nation, the holy nation, then there became less influence in this nation. Well, it's not hard to connect the dots then, because if we're really looking for a turn of the physical nation, it means more people must then become citizens in the holy nation, in the theocracy. In this thing, the church. No, not necessarily Canaan church or even church that we can think of, but at least in the biblical church, they have to be citizens in God's theocracy. Then you have the influence coming the other way. It has to be this winning into citizenship, one soul at a time. One heart at a time, one mind at a time. That's the only true and long haul healing that there can be. That citizenship comes first. That comes first. Then the influence on the nation comes next. Theocracy. If we try to legislate God, it didn't work for Israel. It doesn't work in other areas that we look at in the world today. God's kingdom cannot be done that way. His theocracy is won by the volition of each person in their heart that way. That puts the onus back on us. You know, if you go to the end of the book, you know, that's a great way. If you want to know how the story ends, you go to the end of the book. If you go to the end of the book, God wins. You can read it there. It's true. However, that means God's theocracy will exist. The church itself will exist in some form to the very end of time. In some way, maybe a way we won't even recognize, but this thing, the church, the ecclesia, will exist to the end of time. That doesn't mean our church will be part of it. It doesn't necessarily mean we're citizens. The challenge I would offer you in this is that as we look at what a theocracy is, being citizens in God's kingdom, how do we fit? Are we qualified to be part of that theocracy? Is the Western church in general qualified to be part of that? Is Canaan Church qualified to be part of that? Are you and I qualified to be citizens in that kingdom, in that theocracy? Lessons that go back thousands of years, but they're still valid today.